She had both hands pressed flat against the roof of her own car, fingers spread wide, the cool metal vibrating faintly beneath her palms, and the gun was at her back, not beside her, not pointed at the ground as a warning. At her back, maybe 18 inches from her spine, held by a man in a county sheriff's uniform who had decided somewhere in the last 4 minutes that this was how tonight was going to go. The gravel on the shoulder of Route 9 was biting through the knees of her camouflage trousers. The humid North Carolina air pressed down on everything like a wet hand. And inside the Honda Accord, still idling at the curb, a phone was sitting face up in the center console, its Bluetooth connection perfectly open, its microphone capturing every single sound with the quiet, indifferent efficiency of a machine that does not take sides. On the other end of that call was Major Elijah Garrett, United States Marine Corps. He was not a man who panicked. He had not panicked in Fallujah. He had not panicked when a supply convoy he was responsible for hit an IED outside Kandahar, and he was not panicking now, though every instinct in his body had shifted into a register that most people spend their entire lives never accessing. He was listening. He was tracking GPS, and he was already in his vehicle moving fast. The officer standing behind Corporal Deja Monroe with his service weapon drawn did not know any of this. He knew only what he had decided to know the moment her taillights came into view on this particular stretch of highway, that she was alone, that the road was dark, that no one was watching, and that he was the law. He had been wrong about all 4 of those things. This is not a story about a bad night or a snap judgment or the impossible difficulty of split-second decisions in the dark. Those stories exist, and some of them are even true. This is a different kind of story, the story of a man who spent 11 years building a private empire on a 12-mile stretch of rural road, who chose his victims with the patience of a predator, who had always counted on the darkness to protect him. And this is the story of the night he pulled his gun on the precise wrong woman at the precise wrong moment, and everything he had built. Every protected complaint, every buried report, every dollar he had stolen from people who had no one to call, began to come apart in real time. Deja Monroe's hands were flat on the roof of her car. Her breathing was controlled. Her mind was clear. She had been a Marine for 7 years. She knew how to wait. Raymond Cross walked like a man who was always on the verge of making a point. His weight shifted forward onto the balls of his feet as he moved, jaw working with a low, barely perceptible grinding motion, as though he was perpetually chewing on an argument that nobody around him had been smart enough to start yet. He was 43 years old, thick through the neck and shoulders in the way that comes not from discipline, but from the kind of low-grade physical tension that never fully releases, the kind that accumulates over years of treating every human interaction as a potential confrontation that he needed to win before the other person realized there was a contest happening. He had been a Denton County Sheriff's deputy for 11 years, assigned for the last 6 of those years to the Route 9 corridor, a 12-mile stretch of state highway running between the gates of Fort Caldwell Marine Installation and the nearest town of any size. It was a rural assignment, officially considered undesirable, the kind of posting that senior deputies avoided and rookies were warned about. Cross had requested it. He had specifically in writing requested it. He had requested it because of the darkness. Between mile marker 7 and mile marker 19, there were no functioning streetlights. There were no intersection cameras. The nearest civilian residence was a farmhouse nearly a quarter-mile off the road down a gravel driveway. On a slow night, which most nights were, a deputy could conduct a traffic stop on that stretch, and the only witnesses would be the pine trees. Cross understood this. Cross had built his entire professional life around this understanding. His hatred of the military was not ideological. It had nothing to do with policy or politics. It was personal in the most raw and immediate way. Soldiers and Marines who got pulled over on Route 9 didn't behave the way he needed people to behave. They didn't tremble. They didn't scramble for their registration with shaking hands. They didn't look at his badge with the particular kind of widening eyes that Cross had come to depend on, the way other men depended on coffee, that involuntary acknowledgement that he held all the power and they held none. Instead, they handed over their identification, calmly recited their rights with the ease of people who had been trained to know them, asked respectful but unmistakably firm questions about probable cause. They treated him like a process to be navigated rather than a god to be appeased, and to Raymond Cross that was the deepest possible insult a human being could offer him. He had a philosophy, though he had never articulated it in those exact words even to himself. The side of this road is my courtroom. My badge is my gavel. I decide who goes home tonight. He had operated by this philosophy through 4 excessive force investigations, every single one of which had been reviewed and closed by Sergeant Dale Morrow, his shift supervisor who had been signing favorable incident reports on Cross's behalf for years, in exchange for an arrangement that Cross never discussed on any surface that could be recorded. The complaints had come from people who had been shoved against their vehicles in the dark, from people whose cars had been searched without consent, and whose cash had been seized under the vague authority of civil asset forfeiture, and never properly logged, from people who had been threatened and then charged with resisting arrest when they tried to document what was happening to them. The complaints had been filed. Morrow had reviewed them. The complaints had disappeared. And Cross had learned over 11 years the most dangerous lesson a man in his position can learn, that he was untouchable. There was a physical habit he had developed sometime in the last 4 years, so automatic he was barely conscious of it anymore. His right thumb at rest would drift to the snap release on his holster, not gripping it, not preparing to draw, just resting there, making contact the way another man might touch a wedding ring or tap his fingers on a desk. A reminder. The gun was there. The gun was always there. And in Cross's mind, the gun was the final irrefutable argument that ended every disagreement before the other person had finished forming their rebuttal. There was something else in his glove compartment tucked beneath a road atlas that had not been unfolded in 3 years. A spiral-bound notebook, its cover worn soft with handling its spine, reinforced twice with strips of electrical tape where the binding had begun to separate from use. He had been keeping it for 8 years. In it were dates, times, descriptions of vehicles' plate numbers from out-of-state cars and older model vehicles, the kinds of plates that suggested people passing through people without local connections, people less likely to know the right names to call. He had opened it earlier tonight before beginning his patrol, uncapped his pen, and written the date in the upper right corner of a fresh page. He had not written anything else yet. He was waiting for something worth writing down. He found it at mile marker 11 when the taillights of a dark blue Honda Accord came into his view, and he made a decision. The way he always made decisions on Route 9, quickly, without evidence, and with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once been made to face what that certainty cost other people. He hit his lights. She was in the middle of a sentence about pallet weight discrepancies when the lights hit her mirror. And if the manifest doesn't account for the reconfigured load specs on the second rotation, then we're going to be short on the Kandahar pattern containers by at least 40 units, which means the logistics window closes before. She stopped. She looked at the mirror. She looked at her speedometer, which read 54 miles per hour in a 55 zone. She looked at the road ahead, which was empty and straight, and gave her absolutely no explanation for what was happening behind her. "Hold on a second, Major," she said. "I'm being pulled over." There was a pause on the line. Major Elijah Garrett's voice, which had been moving through supply chain logistics with the brisk efficiency of a man who processes information the way engines process fuel, shifted register in a way that was subtle and immediate and completely unmistakable to anyone who knew him well. "Pulled over? For what, Corporal?" "I genuinely have no idea, sir. I'm at the limit. No lane issues. I'm just past mile marker 11 coming up on the county line crossover." She was already guiding the Honda to the shoulder as she spoke, already running through the protocol in her head, each step arriving in sequence like a checklist she could recite in her sleep, because she had been through this protocol, not in training, but in her own mind, driving this road, preparing for the version of tonight she always hoped would never come. Keep the line open, Major. Don't disconnect, he said, and the warmth that sometimes lived at the edge of his voice when he talked to his Marines had not disappeared exactly. It had moved somewhere underneath the part of him that was already paying close, hard attention to everything. Deja Munro was 28 years old, and she had been a Marine for 7 years. And in those 7 years, she had learned a great many things about herself, most of them in conditions considerably more difficult than a traffic stop on a North Carolina highway. She had done 2 overseas deployments, one of which had included a 6-week period in which the logistics unit she was attached to operated continuously under threat of indirect fire, and during those 6 weeks, she had learned something that no training manual could teach. That the thing fear requires in order to become paralysis is an absence of procedure. Give her a protocol, any protocol, and her body would follow it, and her mind would stay clear enough to do what needed to be done. She was 5 feet 8 inches Marine trim, carrying the particular posture that gets so thoroughly trained into the body that it stops being a choice and becomes a resting state. She stood straight, not because she was thinking about standing straight, but because her body had simply forgotten any other configuration. She was still in her duty clothes from a 13-hour shift, camouflage trousers, and her olive drab undershirt boots, still laced with the tight, precise double knot she put in them every morning out of habit, and kept in them all day out of discipline. She had been driving Route 9 for the better part of a year. She knew every bend in it, every mile marker, every place where the shoulder widened and where it narrowed down to a thin strip of gravel. She had driven this road more than 200 times. She put the Honda in park. She reached up and turned on the interior dome light, flooding the car's cabin with pale yellow. She rolled her window down completely, letting the heavy August air into the car along with the sound of cicadas and the distant hum of the deputy's idling engine. She switched off her own engine. She placed both hands flat on the top of the steering wheel, fingers spread wide, and she waited. Major Garrett's voice came through the Bluetooth speaker, not filling the car, but present steady, the way a compass is present when you need it. "I've got your GPS, Monroe. Don't disconnect." "Yes, sir," she said. She watched the mirror. 2 shadows separated from the patrol car, one moving toward her with a forward-tilting aggressive stride that she registered and filed immediately, and one hanging back at the rear bumper of the cruiser in the posture of someone who wasn't entirely certain this stop was going where his partner seemed to want it to go. The one coming toward her walked fast weight on the balls of his feet, jaw set, not the measured professional approach of an officer who took traffic stops seriously as procedure. This was the walk of someone who had already decided the outcome and was simply traveling toward it. She noted it. She filed it. She kept her hands on the wheel. The logistics report for Major Garrett was already done. She had told him the truth earlier in the call. It was sitting on the server time-stamped, complete, waiting for his 0600 review. She had nothing left to prove to anyone tonight, except that she could handle whatever was coming with the same discipline she brought to everything else, because that was who she was, and no stretch of dark highway and no man walking toward her window with his jaw grinding was going to change it. She breathed in, she breathed out. The footsteps on the gravel got louder and closer and then stopped. He didn't bring a flashlight. He used the cruiser's mounted spotlight instead, angled it directly at her driver's side mirror before he even got out of the car, so that when Deja looked up at him through the window, her eyes were already compromised by the glare, already squinting, already slightly blinded, already at the sensory disadvantage that Cross had spent 11 years learning to manufacture in the first 30 seconds of every stop, because the first 30 seconds, he had always believed, determined everything that followed. "License and registration," he said, not leaning down to speak through the window like an officer conducting a stop, but standing upright above it so that she had to look up at him, so that his face was partially in shadow while hers was fully lit, so that the geometry of their relative positions communicated before a single substantive word was spoken who he believed held the power here. "Good evening, officer," Deja said, and her voice carried the same calm register she used when she briefed supply manifests, even professional and stripped of the particular anxious quality that Cross was used to hearing in the first 10 seconds of a stop, the quality that told him he had already established the terms. She had not given him that. My license is in my wallet in the center console and my registration is in the glove compartment. I want to make sure you know where my hands are going before I reach for either one. Cross's jaw tightened. This was not the opening he wanted. I know how to run a traffic stop. Give me your license. Reaching into the center console now, Deja said, moving slowly and with the narrated deliberateness of someone building a record, not defying him, not performing defiance, but simply making the sequence of events impossible to misrepresent afterward. She retrieved her North Carolina driver's license and beneath it her military ID from Fort Caldwell and held both cards through the open window. Cross took them. He looked at the driver's license, then turned the military ID over in his fingers, looking at it with the particular expression of a man who has found something he was hoping wasn't there. He read the rank. Corporal. He looked at her face in the spotlight, the steady dark eyes, the posture, even in a car seat, the eagle globe and anchor on the collar of her undershirt. Corporal, he said, and the way he shaped the word made it sound like something he was dismissing. You people think that putting on a uniform makes you special. Think it puts you in a different category from everybody else on my road. Inside the Honda, through the open Bluetooth connection, Major Elijah Garrett went completely still. He set down the pen he'd been holding and leaned forward and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because the recording was already doing the work that words would only interrupt. With respect, officer, Deja said, maintaining her composure with the same quality of effort. You maintain a grip on something that matters in a wind, constant, deliberate, and entirely invisible from the outside. I was driving the posted speed limit. Could you tell me the reason for the stop? You swerved, Cross said, and it came out with the smoothness of a line that has been used so many times it has stopped requiring any cognitive engagement to produce a reflex more than a lie, a muscle memory of deception that he had been performing for years. Crossed the double yellow back at marker 9, suspicion of DUI. I haven't had anything to drink, sir. I've been on base for 13 hours and I'm going straight home. Step out of the vehicle. He said it before she had finished her sentence, cutting the end of it off the way you cut a rope, because letting her finish, letting her make her case was not part of the stop as he had designed it. At the rear of the Honda rookie, Kyle Barton, 24 years old and 6 months out of the academy, still in the stage of his career where he was watching everything with the full attention of someone who hasn't yet learned which things he's supposed to stop seeing, had already run her plates on his handheld unit. She was completely clean. The registration was current, the vehicle had no flags, and the driver had no record of any kind. He had murmured this to Cross as Cross was walking up to her window, and Cross had not even turned his head. Barton stood now at the rear corner of the Honda, shifting his weight, watching the stop with the growing unease of a man who can feel something going wrong, but hasn't yet found the language for what it is. I'll step out, Deja said, and she moved with the same narrated precision. Left hand on the door handle, right hand visible on the wheel, door pushed open slowly, feet finding the gravel standing to her full height. I want to state clearly that I am not resisting, and I am cooperating fully with your commands. Cross was already irritated by it in a way he couldn't entirely locate. She was doing everything he told her to do, and it still felt like she was winning something. She wasn't afraid of him, and he could feel that absence the way you feel a cold draft from a window you cannot find real persistent and deeply unsettling. Turn around, hands on the roof. Deja turned. She placed both hands flat against the roof of her car, fingers spread, and the moment she did, Cross moved into her space and placed his forearm between her shoulder blades and leaned his weight into it, pressing her chest forward against the roof with a force that was calibrated not for safety, but for pain designed to hurt enough to demonstrate that he could designed to remind her of the asymmetry he needed her to feel. Then his boot came down on the outside of her right ankle, not a tap, but a kick, forcing her legs apart and sending a sharp, immediate pain up through her shin and into her knee. She gasped. She kept her hands flat on the roof. "Sir," she said, and her voice was tighter now, controlled with a visible effort that the training made possible, but that no training could make effortless. "You are using unnecessary force. I am cooperating fully. I want it on the record that I am a corporal in the United States Marine Corps, and my commanding officer is currently on the phone inside this vehicle, and he is hearing everything that is happening out here. Raymond Cross had made bad decisions before, but what he did in the next 8 seconds was the decision that cost him everything. Not because it was the worst thing he had ever done on Route 9, but because it was the first thing he had ever done on Route 9 with a witness he couldn't control. The idea that he was being monitored, that this woman had a witness he could not see or reach, that every word since he'd approached her window had been captured, that she had been not just enduring the stop, but documenting it with the calm efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this scenario, broke something open in him that lived below the level of reason. The badge was supposed to make him sovereign on this road. The darkness was supposed to be his protection, and here was this woman calm as stone telling him calmly that she had already made him visible. His hand went to his holster. The snap release clicked. The sound of the gun clearing leather was clean and sharp in the night air. "Get on your knees," Cross said, and his voice had dropped into a register that was quieter and more dangerous than anything he had said before tonight, the voice of a man who has run out of tools except the one he should never use. He stepped back and leveled the weapon at the center of her back. "Right now, or I will put you down on this road." "Greg!" Barton's voice came from behind the car, the voice of a man watching something go off a bridge in slow motion. "Greg, she is not armed. We ran her plates, she's clean. She hasn't done anything you need to shut your mouth." Cross did not look at him. Deja Munro lowered herself to her knees on the gravel of Route 9. The stones pressed through the fabric of her trousers and into her skin. She laced her fingers behind her head. The gun at her back was not abstract or theoretical. She could feel the presence of it with every nerve ending she had. The way you feel a temperature change before you can name what it is. She thought with the kind of focus that arrives when the mind has been stripped of everything except what matters right now. Stay calm. Stay visible. Every second is evidence. And inside the Honda, through the Bluetooth speaker, Major Elijah Garrett's voice came into the night air with a clarity and volume that left no room for interpretation. "This is Major Elijah Garrett, United States Marine Corps Fort Caldwell installation. I have been on this line for 19 minutes. I have heard everything. You have drawn a loaded weapon on an unarmed, compliant Marine corporal without legal justification, and you are committing a felony assault under color of law. Lower your weapon immediately." Cross's eyes moved to the window of the Honda. His jaw worked. The gun did not move. "This is a county matter," Cross said loudly enough to be heard through the open window. "Your Marine is being detained for DUI and she is resisting. This is not your jurisdiction." "I am 4 minutes from your position," Garrett's voice came back, and beneath the authority of it was something colder and more final than anger, the tone of a man who has already made every decision he needs to make and is now simply executing them in sequence. "I have recorded this entire conversation from the beginning. Lower your weapon." Cross stood on the shoulder of Route 9 with his gun pointed at a kneeling Marine, and he looked out into the darkness of the highway beyond his cruiser's lights. And for the first time in 11 years, he looked for the thing that had always been there. The institutional protection, the sense that the darkness was his. The absolute certainty that there were no consequences on this road, and found that it was not there. Barton was 6 feet away. He was not moving toward the subject. He was not flanking. He was standing with his hands at his sides, and when Cross looked at him, Barton looked back with an expression that contained no solidarity at all. The first headlights appeared around the bend at mile marker 13, moving fast. The headlights were still a quarter mile out when Garrett's voice came through the speaker again, and everything administrative and measured had been stripped from it. Now what remained was the essential instrument, the voice pared down to its purpose. "Officer, I want to be very clear with you about what is happening in the next 3 minutes because I don't think you have fully understood your situation yet." Garrett spoke with the cadence of a man who has given briefings where imprecise language cost lives, where the difference between clarity and ambiguity was the difference between a successful operation and a catastrophic one. I have been on an open Bluetooth connection with Corporal Monroe since before you approached her vehicle. I have a recording of this entire stop, your exact words when you saw her military, ID your fabricated justification, the sound of you applying physical force to her back, the sound of your boot making contact with her ankle, and the sound of your weapon clearing its holster. That recording is uploading to a secure server in real time. Cross's gun arm was still extended, still level, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Some quality of certainty had begun to thin at the edges, the way ice begins to thin before it gives way from the inside out. This is a county matter, Cross said again, but the third repetition had begun to sound exactly like what it was, a man trying to reinstate a reality that was dissolving faster than he could reconstruct it. She was acting erratic. She refused lawful commands. I felt my safety was... She narrated every movement she made before she made it. Garrett's voice cut across his sentence without raising its volume by a single degree. She told you exactly where her hands were going. She told you she was cooperating. I heard all of it, every word, and you responded by pressing her against her vehicle and drawing your service weapon. A beat of silence, the kind of silence that is not empty but full of something being measured. That is not a judgment call, officer. That is a federal crime. On the gravel of Route 9, Barton had stopped maintaining any pretense of a neutral position. He had taken a small unconscious step sideways away from Cross toward the Honda. The physical expression of a decision that his body had made before his mind had finished making it. 6 months on the job. 6 months of watching Cross work this road. 6 months of knowing what the notebook in the glove compartment was and telling himself it wasn't his problem to solve. Cuff her. Cross said it to Barton without moving his eyes from the car window. Get her in the back and we'll document at the station. Barton didn't move. The silence that followed had a weight to it that was almost physical. I can't do that, Greg, Barton said, and his voice was quiet and entirely steady, which was the most surprising thing about it because the steadiness had not been there 30 minutes ago, and it had come from somewhere he hadn't known existed in him until this moment. We don't have probable cause for the stop. There's zero evidence of intoxication. She's been compliant since before you reached her window. He paused, and what came next was the sentence that defined him, the one he would carry out of this night and into every night that followed. I'm not putting a compliant woman on the ground at gunpoint because you need her to be guilty. Cross turned to look at him fully, and what he found on Barton's face was not aggression, not accusation, not the heat of confrontation, just a kind of quiet, exhausted refusal that was somehow worse than all of those things, because it meant he was alone on this road for the first time in 11 years. Garrett's voice came through the speaker one final time before the headlights rounded the bend. I am giving you the opportunity to lower your weapon before I arrive, officer. What happens after I arrive is determined by the position of that gun when I get there. This is the last time I will say it. Cross looked at the gun in his hand. He looked at the darkness. He looked at Deja Monroe on her knees on the gravel of a road he had owned for 11 years. The Tahoe came around the bend. The military-issue Chevrolet Tahoe came around the bend at mile marker 13 without its headlights on a deliberate, tactical approach, controlled and intentional, the kind of movement that communicates before anyone has said a word, that the people inside are not arriving but deploying. Cross didn't see it until it was already past the curve and rolling to a stop directly behind his cruiser, and by then the doors were already opening. Major Elijah Garrett stepped out of the driver's side, and in the combined light of the cruiser's spotlight and the Tahoe's running lamps, Raymond Cross encountered for the first time in his career a form of authority that bore no resemblance to anything he had ever used himself. Cross's authority had always been performed. It lived in the volume of his voice, in the forward tilt of his body, in the snap release on his holster, in the deliberate invasion of other people's personal space. It was authority that required constant maintenance, that needed the other person's fear to sustain it, that collapsed without an audience to receive it. What Garrett carried needed none of those things. It was not performed, not projected, not dependent on anyone else's reaction. It was simply present in him the way density is present in stone. You don't see it until you get close to it, and then you feel the weight before you can explain why. He was in his utility uniform, the same camouflage pattern as Deja's, and the rank insignia on his collar caught the ambient light as he walked forward. He did not walk fast. He covered the distance between the Tahoe and the patrol car with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has never needed to hurry because he has always been in every room he entered the most consequential person in it. Behind him, 2 military police officers had taken up positions flanking the rear of Cross's cruiser, hands resting on holstered sidearms, eyes locked on Cross with the fixed professional attention of people who have been given specific instructions and are going to follow them with absolute precision. Garrett walked past Cross entirely. Walked past him as though he were a feature of the road rather than a person who required acknowledgement. He walked straight to the spot on the gravel where Deja Monroe was kneeling, and he stood in front of her and looked down at her with an expression that was not warmth. Exactly, Garrett was not a warm expression man, but which contained something underneath the command register that was close to it. "On your feet, Monroe." Deja unlaced her fingers from behind her head. She took the hand he extended and she rose, and the Marine bearing came back into her body immediately and automatically shoulders level, chin up, eyes forward, the way something returns to its shape after the pressure has been released. She dusted the gravel from the knees of her trousers in 2 short, precise motions. "Are you injured?" "Ankle where he kicked it, sir. Bruising on the ribs from the car. Nothing requiring treatment tonight." Garrett's jaw tightened in a way that was brief and visible, and then carefully, deliberately controlled. He turned to face Raymond Cross. What followed was not a confrontation in the way that word usually implies. Garrett stood in the space between the Honda and the patrol car, and he spoke at exactly the volume required for everyone present to hear every word, and what he delivered was a methodical account. This is what occurred, stated in sequence, stated as fact. The way a flight recorder plays back the sequence of events that preceded an impact. He did not editorialize. He did not raise his voice. He simply laid the record down in front of Cross like something that was going to be there whether Cross acknowledged it or not. Cross tried to interrupt. The first time Garrett paused, waited for the interruption to finish, and then continued from exactly where he had stopped as though the interruption had not constituted a meaningful event. The second time, Garrett simply looked at Cross and said, "I'm not finished," in a tone that contained no heat and no menace and no room for argument, and Cross stopped. Then Garrett turned to Barton. He held eye contact for a moment before he spoke, giving the younger man time to settle to understand that this was a question being asked in good faith. "Officer Barton, you were present for the entirety of this stop. Did this officer draw his service weapon on a compliant unarmed individual without cause?" Barton's throat moved. 6 months. 6 months of knowing things and saying nothing. "Yes, sir," he said. "He did." Cross looked at him. Barton held the look. Garrett looked at Cross again, and this time when he spoke, his voice dropped to the register he reserved for things that were final. "You pulled a weapon on my Marine," he said. "Because she knew her rights and because she wasn't afraid of you. That is not law enforcement. That is something else entirely, and tonight you are going to begin learning the difference." He looked at the gun still in Cross's hand, still not holstered. "Put it away." Cross holstered the weapon. His hand was trembling, and everyone on Route 9 could see that it was trembling, and that visibility. The simple, undeniable public fact of the trembling hand was the first thing the darkness had ever failed to protect him from. Garrett put his hand briefly on Deja's shoulder, not to guide her. She didn't need guidance, but in the way of a man who has been listening to something terrible happening from 4 miles away, and has spent those miles traveling toward it as fast as the road allowed, and is now simply confirming that she is real and standing and whole. "The MPs will stay with these 2 until the supervisor arrives," he said. "Go wait in the vehicle." "Yes, sir," Deja said, and she turned toward the Tahoe. She walked along the shoulder of Route 9 with her hands at her sides and her bearing steady, except for the slight hitch in her right ankle, and she passed within 4 feet of Raymond Cross, and she stopped. Not dramatically. There was nothing theatrical about it. She simply stopped, the way a thought stops you mid-step, something that needed to be acknowledged before she could continue past it. She turned her head and she looked at Raymond Cross. He was standing in the combined light of the cruiser's spotlight and the Tahoe's running lamps, and without his gun in his hand, and without the darkness of Route 9 and the isolation that had always been his armor, he looked like what he was, a man in a uniform on the side of a road who had made a decision he could not unmake. The specific quality of him had changed, not his physical size, but the weight of him, the sense of presence he had carried walking toward her window 25 minutes ago. It had gone somewhere. Or perhaps it had never been real weight at all, only the impression of weight, the way a shadow can look solid until you reach for it. Deja looked at him the way you look at something you have studied carefully, and now understand completely with the settled attention of someone who no longer has any questions about what she is seeing. There was no anger in it. There was no satisfaction. There was no fear. There had never been fear in the way Cross had needed there to be. There had been the precise managed awareness of danger that a trained person carries through a dangerous situation, which is an entirely different thing and which Cross had entirely failed to recognize as different because he had spent 11 years needing his subjects to be afraid of him, and had assumed that anything other than fear was either dishonesty or stupidity. What was in Deja's eyes was something quieter and more permanent than any emotion. It was the expression of a person who has seen something clearly and knows that clarity is permanent. Cross looked back at her, and for the first time since his spotlight had found her taillights at mile marker 11, he actually saw her not as an obstacle or a subject or a problem to be managed in the dark, but as a person who had been present for every single second of what had just happened on this road, who had experienced everything he had done in real time and with complete awareness, and who was still standing. The gun had not broken her. The gravel on her knees had not broken her. He looked at her eyes and found nothing there that he had put there, none of his power, none of his fear, none of the submission he had needed from her, and that absolute absence was the most frightening thing he had encountered on Route 9 in 11 years. The cicadas were loud in the trees. The idling engines hummed. Somewhere around the bend, the first distant sound of approaching sirens had begun faint, growing minutes away, but coming with the certainty of something that has been set in motion and will not stop. Deja turned away from him. She walked to the Tahoe, opened the heavy door and got in, and the door closed behind her with the clean, definitive sound of something that is finished. Cross was left standing on the shoulder of his road alone in the light of his own cruiser with the sirens getting louder. Chief Walter Pruitt had been in law enforcement for 25 years, and in that time he had developed an internal taxonomy of dread-specific categories of bad news, each with its own weight and texture and the particular way it settled in your chest when the call came in. The dread of a line-of-duty death was the heaviest and most absolute. The dread of a corruption investigation had a slower, more corrosive quality like water getting into a foundation. And there was this kind of dread the Code 3 supervisor request from a rookie, the military vehicle mentioned in the dispatch note, the location that was mile marker 11 on Route 9, and the name of the deputy who had initiated the stop, which had its own specific sick quality, that Pruitt recognized because he had been waiting for it in the way you wait for the thing you've been afraid of for years and have been unable to prevent for a long time. He knew it was Cross before dispatch finished reading him the full location. He pulled his command SUV to the shoulder behind the military Tahoe and the two cruisers already present, and before he got out he sat for a moment, taking in the complete picture. The two military police officers standing at parade rest near Cross's cruiser. Barton sitting on the hood of the second patrol car with his head in his hands. Cross standing alone on the gravel with the particular quality of a man who has had something removed from him and hasn't yet learned to stand without it, and the Tahoe with its tinted windows. It was the scene of a situation that had already moved past the point where his arrival could manage it. He could only assess the full extent of the damage and begin to determine which direction it was going to travel. Garrett was already walking toward him before Pruitt had taken 4 steps from his vehicle, and in the first few seconds of the approach, Pruitt registered the type of authority he was dealing with. Not hostile, not aggressive, not the particular friction that sometimes complicated military-civilian interactions, but direct, fully prepared, and in possession of considerably more information than Pruitt had. Garrett laid it out the way he would have laid out a military incident report, the stop, the fabricated justification, the recording that had been running since before Cross reached the window, the physical force, the drawn weapon, Barton's refusal to participate in the cuffing. He delivered each element in order without editorializing, and Pruitt listened without interrupting, because every sentence Garrett delivered was a stone being placed on a scale that had been accumulating weight for 6 years. "You have the recording," Pruitt said. "Uploading since the stop began," Garrett said. 41 minutes of audio." Pruitt walked to where Cross was standing. Cross's eyes came up when he heard the footsteps, and there was still something in them that wanted to mount a defense, that was reaching for the familiar script. The version where the supervisor arrived and the institution closed around the incident, and the complaint became a file number, and the file number became a closed matter. Cross had walked away from 4 investigations in 11 years. His body still remembered what that felt like, and it was trying to find its way back to that feeling the way an animal tries to find its way back to familiar ground. "Chief," Cross said, and his voice carried most of its usual certainty, most but not quite all the way. "A structure holds most of its shape even after the thing that was holding it up has been removed. There's context here that you need before you hear the other version. The driver was Officer Barton," Pruitt said, not to Cross. Barton slid off the hood of the patrol car and walked over, and the walk cost him something visible not in his pace, which was steady, but in the quality of his face, which carried the specific expression of a person who has been holding something for a long time and is now setting it down in a way they cannot take back. He stood in front of Chief Pruitt, and when Pruitt asked him directly, simply, without framing what he had witnessed tonight on Route 9, Barton told him all of it. From the moment he ran her plates and came back clean, to the moment he told Cross he would not put a compliant woman in cuffs at gunpoint, to the moment Garrett's Tahoe came around the bend. Every detail, in order, without softening anything. Cross watched Barton talk. The expression on his face moved through several things. First, disbelief that Barton was actually doing this, then a specific cold fury that had the quality of betrayal in it. Then something underneath the fury that he was working to keep off his face and only partially succeeding. The blue wall was not a building you could watch falling. It was a decision that each individual person either made or didn't, and Barton was making it now in public in front of 6 arriving officers, and the making of it was the loudest sound on Route 9. When Barton finished, Pruitt turned to Cross. His voice had settled into the register that Cross had heard him use exactly twice before in 11 years, quiet entirely, certain with nothing in it that performed authority because it didn't need to. "Ray, turn around." Cross blinked. The old script was still running somewhere in his mind, still trying to find its footing. "Chief, listen to me for 1 minute. The chain of events that brought us here started with her refusing a turn around," Pruitt said again with the same quietness, and the repetition was not impatience, but finality. The second saying of a thing that was not going to be said a third time. Cross turned around. Pruitt stepped behind him and removed Cross's service weapon from its holster. He removed the badge from Cross's chest. He held both objects for a moment, looking at them with the expression of a man confirming something he has known for a long time. And then he handed them to the nearest officer as though they were equipment that needed to be returned to the proper department, which was exactly what they were. He placed Cross's wrists behind his back. The handcuffs went on the same clicking ratchet, the same cold metal, the same sound that Cross had used on dozens of people on this road over 11 years, and Pruitt read the charges aloud, standing in the light of 6 patrol cars and a military Tahoe, clearly enough that every officer present heard every word. Cross began to cry. Not the releasing, cathartic cry of someone reaching genuine remorse, but the desperate animal cry of a man whose entire sense of himself has just been physically removed. who does not know who he is without the badge and the gun and the road and the darkness, and who is only now too late discovering that those things had been the whole of him. The sound was small and ugly, and it carried in the night air in a way that no one on Route 9 that night would forget. Inside the Tahoe, through tinted glass, Deja Monroe watched Raymond Cross walk to the rear of Pruitt's SUV and be placed in the back seat. She watched without expression, without the need for more than she had already seen. Then she looked down at her own hands in her lap, the hand she had kept flat and steady on the roof of her car through the forearm in her back and the boot on her ankle and the gun pressed at her spine. The knuckles were fine. The palms were fine. 2 faint pink impressions in the heel of her right hand where the roof's edge had pressed already fading. Garrett opened the driver's door and got in. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. "This doesn't end tonight," he said.
"I know, sir," she said. "FBI at 0800. I'll be there before you pour your first cup," she said, because that was what she had told him about the logistics report, and it had been true then, and it was true now, because that was simply who she was.
Barton didn't sleep. He had gone home at the end of his shift, stood in the shower until the hot water ran out, and then sat on the edge of his bed with the lights on, and replayed Route 9 from the moment Cross's lights hit the Honda's taillights to the moment Pruitt read Cross his charges, and then he replayed it again, and somewhere in the third replay, he stopped at a specific moment and stayed there, the sound of Cross's gun clearing its holster, the soft, clean, mechanical click of it, and the image of a woman on her knees on gravel, with her hands laced behind her head, not begging, not shaking, just waiting with the steady, terrible patience of someone who has been trained to survive things. He had found the notebook 3 weeks ago. It had been a slow Tuesday afternoon, the kind of shift where the heat makes the inside of the patrol car feel like a storage unit and nothing moves, and time thickens. He had reached into the glove compartment of Cross's cruiser for the vehicle log to fill in his hours, and the notebook had come out with it falling open to a page somewhere near the middle. He had read 4 lines before he understood what he was looking at. He had understood in 4 lines because the notation was not subtle dates, plate numbers, dollar amounts, and beside the highest dollar entries, 2 sets of initials in ballpoint pen. DMBH. He had closed the notebook, put it back exactly where he'd found it, and spent the following 3 weeks building a careful, detailed architecture of reasons for why this was not his responsibility to act on. He didn't have enough context. He couldn't prove what the initials meant. The notebook could be something else, something he was misreading. Cross was a senior officer, and Morrow was his direct supervisor, and Holt ran the union, and none of those were small things to go up against when you were 6 months out of the academy with no institutional standing and no protection. The architecture held for 3 weeks. It collapsed sometime around 3 a.m. under the weight of a woman's hands flat on the roof of a car. He drove to the precinct before the morning briefing. He sat in his car in the parking lot for 11 minutes and looked at the entrance. Then he got out and went in. Chief Pruitt's office light was already on because Pruitt was the kind of man who arrived first on the days when something had happened the night before, and because he probably also hadn't slept. Barton knocked. He went in. He set the notebook on Pruitt's desk and sat down across from him and said, "I found this 3 weeks ago, and I should have brought it to you the same day. I didn't, and I'm sorry for that." Then he talked for 2 hours. The notebook was a record that Cross had kept with the meticulous, almost proprietary care of a man who was proud of what he was documenting, who wanted to be able to review his own work, who perhaps needed the accounting of it to confirm to himself the scale of what he had built. 8 years of dates, times, vehicle descriptions, plate numbers from out-of-state cars and older models, the kinds of plates that meant people passing through people without local connections, people less likely to know who to call. In the right-hand column, dollar amounts ranging from $300 to just over $4,000, logged with the casual precision of someone who had stopped thinking of the money as stolen and started thinking of it as earned. And in a separate column, 2 sets of initials that appeared with regularity on the highest entries. DM appearing 17 times. Sergeant Dale Morrow Cross's shift supervisor, the man who had reviewed and closed 4 excessive force investigations in 6 years, who had been signing favorable incident reports that matched whatever story Cross told rather than whatever had actually occurred. BH appearing 11 times. Bruce Holt, chapter president of the local law enforcement union, the man whose office served as the first point of contact for any complaint filed against an officer, which meant he had been the first point of contact for everything filed against Cross. And now there was a notebook suggesting he had been taking a cut of what Cross extracted from the road. Cross had been the operation. Morrow had been the cover. Holt had been the shield. 3 people. 8 years. A 12-mile stretch of road in the dark. Pruitt sat with the notebook open in front of him for a long time after Barton finished talking, turning pages slowly, reading certain entries twice. His face carried the expression of a man whose worst suspicion has just been confirmed in the worst possible way. Not vindication, because there is nothing that feels like vindication when the thing you feared turns out to be real, just the full weight of it arriving all at once. He closed the notebook. He looked at Barton. Why 3 weeks? Barton didn't reach for a comfortable answer. Because I was scared of Morrow, he said. And because I convinced myself I couldn't prove anything with just a notebook. And because going after a sergeant and a union president when you've been on the job 6 months felt like a way to end a career before it started. He paused. And then last night happened. Pruitt picked up his phone and dialed Special Agent Patricia Cobb at the FBI field office, and when she answered, he told her he had something she needed to see, and she told him she had been waiting for exactly this kind of call for 18 months, and she would be there within the hour. Special Agent Patricia Cobb's office was the kind of room that had been entirely surrendered to function, no decoration, no softening. Just the organized density of a space used by someone who treats their environment as a tool and keeps their tools in order. She was at her desk when Deja and Garrett were shown in at exactly 0800, and she rose and shook hands with both of them without ceremony and gestured to the chairs across from her and sat back down. Because Cobb was not a small-talk person, and Garrett was not a small-talk person. And Deja was a Marine who had been told 0800, and it was 0800, and she was here with the same quality of presence she brought to everything. I listened to the full recording last night, Cobb said, looking at Deja directly. All 41 minutes of it. I want to hear it in your own words now, in sequence, and I want to know if anything you experienced is not captured on the recording. Deja gave her account the same way she gave all her accounts, in order, without editorializing, without performing either the trauma or the composure that had made survival possible. She started at the moment the lights hit her mirror, and went through each step to the moment she got into Garrett's Tahoe. Cobb made notes and did not interrupt. When Deja finished, Cobb looked at Garrett. The Marine Corps' position. The Marine Corps considers this an assault on an active duty service member and will cooperate fully with a federal civil rights investigation, Garrett said. Every resource Fort Caldwell has is available to you. Cobb nodded. She set down her pen. The recording gives us Cross on Title 18, Section 242, without ambiguity, deprivation of rights under color of law. The federal magistrate who signed the warrant covering the Bluetooth call has already been briefed, and the warrant is watertight. She opened a folder. But this morning Chief Pruitt brought us something that changes the scope of the case considerably. She turned the notebook around so Deja and Garrett could see the open page, the dates, the amounts, the 2 sets of initials in ballpoint pen. 8 years, 3 people. A structure that was designed specifically to make what Cross was doing on Route 9 survive any complaint that came in. Deja looked at the notebook page for a long moment. When she looked up, her voice was level and entirely clear. I don't want just Cross, she said. Not as a demand, not as a plea, but as a statement of position delivered with the same quiet certainty she'd used asking Cross for his badge number from the gravel of Route 9. I want whoever made it possible for a man like that to work that road for 11 years. Cobb held her gaze for a moment that was slightly longer than strictly professional. "Then you're going to want to hear what we found in that notebook," she said, "and what we need to do next." She walked them through it, and as she did, the shape of what Raymond Cross had operated on Route 9 came into focus, not as the isolated acts of one bad officer having bad nights, but as something with structure and logic and three people playing three distinct and necessary roles. And the full weight of that understanding settled into the room as something that required not just a response, but a carefully designed one, because the goal was not to end Cross's career, which had already ended on the shoulder of Route 9 last night. The goal was to end the entire thing, all three of them simultaneously, in a way that left no part of it standing to rebuild itself under a different name. Deja looked at Cobb. "What do you need from me?" "Your testimony, your service record, and your patience," Cobb said. "The trap has to be built correctly or it only catches part of what's in it." "How long?" Garrett asked. "Days," Cobb said, "not weeks. Morrow has already called Barton in for what he described as a friendly conversation. He thinks he still has time to manage this." She closed the folder. "He doesn't." Cobb pulled 3 chairs around to one side of her desk so that she and Deja and Garrett were looking at the same surface together rather than across it from each other, and she spread out the documents the way you'd spread out a map when you need everyone in the room to orient to the same terrain. The cross-referenced duty rosters. Morrow's incident sign-off records annotated in red, where the complaint dates aligned with the notebook entries. Bank records still partially redacted pending the full warrant, but enough to show the pattern already. And the notebook itself open to the page where the initials appeared most frequently. "Walk me through what you see," she said to Deja. Not because she needed Deja's analysis, but because she had learned over a career of building federal cases that the person who is wronged often sees the structure of the wrongdoing more clearly than anyone else in the room, because they experienced it from inside it. Deja looked at the materials for a long moment. "Cross picked the road," she said. "He didn't end up on Route 9 by accident. He requested that posting. He chose the dark stretch, the one with no cameras and no civilian witnesses. That's the operation." "Morrow." She tapped the annotated incident log, is why none of the complaints stuck. Every time someone filed a report, it went to the person who was paid to make it disappear, and Holt. She looked at the union records, is the reason the complaints that didn't disappear immediately still went nowhere. The union used arbitration to run out the clock. Cobb nodded slowly. "Each one of them needed the other two," she said. "Take anyone away and the whole thing weakens. Cross without Morrow's cover is just a cop with excessive force complaints that reach the chief's desk and eventually get him fired. Morrow without Holt's shield runs out of procedural tools to bury complaints at the department level. Holt without Cross has no operation to protect and no revenue to skim." She tapped the financial records. 15% of every dollar Cross took went to Morrow. 10% went to Holt. Over 8 years, based on what we can confirm in the notebook, that's nearly $200,000 in stolen funds moving through what amounts to a private criminal arrangement hidden inside a public institution. Garrett had been listening without speaking the way he listened when he was building a complete picture before he said anything. "What do you need to put all 3 of them in federal court simultaneously?" he asked. "The notebook gives me Cross," Cobb said. "Your recording and Barton's testimony give me Cross. The recordings from the Bluetooth call give me Cross so completely that his defense attorney is probably already having a difficult professional week." She paused. "Morrow and Holt are a different problem. I can connect them to the money. I can show the pattern of complaint suppression. But to charge them with conspiracy and witness intimidation, the charges that put them away for a serious length of time, rather than a plea that gives them 2 years and a fine, I need them saying the thing on tape that they have spent 8 years being careful never to say anywhere it could be recorded." "Morrow already called Barton," Garrett said. "This morning," Cobb said. "He wants to meet." He framed it as a check-in, a supervisory conversation, a "let me make sure you're okay after a difficult shift." She looked at the phone record on the desk. He said it in almost exactly those words.
which tells me he's scared enough to move fast, but still confident enough to think he can manage it. She looked at both of them. I need Barton to wear a wire into that meeting. If Morrow says what I believe he's going to say, we'll have everything we need for the full conspiracy charge.
She paused before continuing because what came next was not a formality. I am not going to minimize what I'm asking of a 24-year-old officer with 6 months on the job. If Morrow suspects the wire, the situation in that room becomes genuinely dangerous. Deja looked at the notebook at the 8 years of dates and dollar amounts and 2 sets of initials. She looked at the annotated complaint log, 4 reports, 4 closures, all in Morrow's handwriting. She thought about the people whose names were in the notebook, the ones who had filed those complaints and watched them disappear, the ones who hadn't even filed because they knew better. She looked at Cobb. Barton will do it, she said. He already knows he should have done something 3 weeks ago. He won't wait again. She was right. The device was smaller than Barton had expected, a thin transmitter taped to his sternum with medical adhesive, the microphone embedded in his undershirt with a technology that would have seemed implausible to him a week ago before the events of Route 9 had substantially revised his understanding of what was real and what was possible. He stood in a back room of the FBI field office while a technician ran the sound check, and he looked at the wall and breathed steadily and thought about the notebook, and about the woman on her knees on the gravel, and about the 3 weeks he had waited. Cobb gave him the parameters. Keep them talking, let them do the work. Don't rush them toward the statement you need. Your job is to ask the question that gets them to answer it in their own words, she said. You don't need a confession to everything. You need them to say the thing that makes a jury understand that they knew exactly what they were doing. She looked at him straight. If anything in that room escalates past what I've described we come in, you will not be alone in there. Barton walked into the precinct at 2:17 in the afternoon. Morrow met him at the evidence lockup corridor with the studied, careful warmth of a man who needs something and has decided that warmth is the most efficient delivery mechanism. A hand on the shoulder, a comment about the difficulty of last night, a suggestion that they step somewhere private. All of it precisely calibrated to make the conversation feel voluntary and collegial. Holt was already in the lockup, leaning against the chain link of the evidence cage, arms folded, wearing his union lanyard. He gave Barton the look that was meant to communicate solidarity and communicated instead the specific attention of someone who is calculating in real time what the correct amount of pressure is and whether he is applying it yet. Morrow started soft. That was his tell the softness, the care, the measured deployment of concern as an opening move. He talked about how fast things could look wrong when they weren't wrong. He talked about darkness and distance and the difficulty of assessing force levels under high stress conditions. He talked about how a young officer in his first year could easily misread what he was seeing, could have the recording shape his memory afterward, could find that what he thought he witnessed wasn't necessarily what had actually occurred. What I saw is what I told the chief, Barton said. He kept his voice at the exact edge of hesitant enough uncertainty to suggest he was reachable, not enough to seem like he had already been reached. I don't know how I make that account different without it being a lie. Morrow's expression shifted by a fraction, the softness held, but something harder moved underneath it. Kyle, he said, leaning slightly forward, nobody is asking you to lie. We're asking you to think carefully about the limits of your own perception. You were 20 feet away in the dark. You heard the recording afterward. Now, the recording is how you remember it, but that's not necessarily what your eyes saw in real time. He let that sit for a moment. Saying you're not certain of everything you witnessed is not a lie. It's an honest reflection of imperfect observation conditions. And if I can't get to that, Barton said. Holt pushed off from the chain link. He didn't bother with Morrow's softness at all. Then we have a serious problem, he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who has decided that the time for the other approach has passed. You're not just putting Cross away with your testimony. You're opening a door that connects to Morrow, connects to me, connects to 8 years of department business that the FBI is now going to examine with a magnifying glass. You understand that? Are you asking me to change my testimony? Barton said clearly at a volume slightly higher than necessary, the way Cobb had told him to ask the question that needed to be asked on tape. Morrow looked at him for a long moment. Then the last of the softness went away. "I'm telling you," he said, and his voice was flat and deliberate and entirely without warmth. "Now, that you are a probationary officer with no union protection and no institutional standing. If you walk into a federal proceeding and say what you've been saying, Holt pulls your certification at the state board level for insubordination and conduct unbecoming, and if that doesn't work..." He glanced at Holt, a brief, confirming look. "Accidents happen on night patrol to officers who don't know how to be team players." The door opened. Cobb entered with 2 agents behind her, and the quality of the room changed instantly and completely the way a room changes when something that was contained stops being contained. "Sergeant Dale Morrow, Bruce Holt." Cobb's voice was entirely level. "Keep your hands exactly where I can see them. You are both under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, wire fraud, and making terroristic threats against a federal witness." She looked at Morrow specifically. "Everything you just said in this room is on tape. Every word." Barton stepped aside and watched 2 men who had spent years deciding other people's fates get introduced to the machinery they had always assumed was working for them. They came before dawn, which is how these things are done when the people being arrested are law enforcement quickly before the shift change, before word can travel through the department's informal channels and give anyone time to move things, shred things, call people. Before the institutional protection that these 3 men had spent years constructing could be activated on their behalf one final time. Cross's door was first. The FBI tactical team was at his house on Birchwood Lane at 5:43 in the morning, and a single reporter from the county paper tipped the previous evening by Cobb, who had spent enough years doing this work to understand that public accountability is not a footnote to justice, but a working component of it, was parked across the street when Cross was walked out the front door in handcuffs, wearing sweatpants and an undershirt, feet in slides, the house behind him already, for all practical purposes, no longer his. The image ran on the county paper's website at 6:15. By 8:03, regional news stations had it. By 10, it was national. Morrow was arrested at his desk in the precinct at 6:02. He was already there, the early arrival of a man who had spent a sleepless night trying to parse what Barton's careful, slightly too hesitant answers in the evidence lockup had really meant, and whether there was still a move available to him. There was not. Cobb and 2 agents walked through the front door, past the duty desk, directly to his office, and placed him in custody in front of 6 officers who happened to be starting their morning shift, and who witnessed every second of it without looking away. Holt was arrested at his home at 6:17. He did not go quietly, which the agents noted professionally and found personally unremarkable, because people who have spent years using institutional machinery as a personal shield tend to respond to its removal as a procedural error rather than an accountability event, and they tend to say so loudly and at length until the handcuffs go on and the door of the transport vehicle closes. By mid-morning, Cross was in a federal holding cell trying to reach Morrow on the phone he was permitted to use. No answer. He tried Holt. No answer. He tried the union's main line. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail because the union's emergency board had convened at 9 that morning and taken 11 minutes to vote unanimously to withdraw all legal and financial support from all 3 men. The vote was not difficult. The audio from the evidence lockup had been summarized in the briefing, and accidents happen on night patrol to officers who don't know how to be team players, spoken in Morrow's voice, with Holt present, and concurring, made all 3 of them not just indefensible, but dangerous to the institution that had protected them for years. The Union had many interests. Protecting men who had recorded themselves making death threats against a federal witness was not among them. Cross sat in his cell with the phone in his hand and the voicemail playing, and he set the phone down on the bunk beside him and looked at the wall, and in the silence of the holding cell, he felt for the first time what it was like to be on the side of the road with no one coming. Morrow's attorney called the FBI at 11:47 that morning to discuss a plea. Holt's attorney called at 2:15. Cross refused any conversation about a plea and asked for a trial date because he was still at this stage the kind of man who believed that a room full of people would eventually see things his way, who had spent 11 years counting on exactly that, and he was going to learn in the most comprehensive and final way imaginable how wrong that belief was. What Cross did not know yet in his holding cell was that the last time Morrow and Holt had spoken to each other before their arrests, the conversation in Morrow's car the previous night attempting to align their stories had also been recorded. Cobb had obtained the warrant for Morrow's personal vehicle the same afternoon she'd obtained the wire authorization for Barton because she had been doing this long enough to know that people who are frightened make phone calls, and people who make phone calls in cars they believe are private often say the most useful things they will ever say. That recording would become Exhibit D at trial. Cross in his cell did not know this. He was still building his version of events in his head, still believing in its power to persuade, still counting on the darkness of Route 9 to protect him, even now that the lights had come on. AUSA. James Whitfield presented the federal indictment 3 weeks after the arrests, and the courtroom had the specific atmosphere of a room where things are formalized, where what has already happened in the world is given its official name and its official weight and its official position in the record that will outlast everyone present. Whitfield read the charges in the sequence that told the story most completely, which was also the sequence that would make the most sense to a jury. For Raymond Cross, 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law, which in cases involving a dangerous weapon carried a maximum sentence of 10 years. 1 count of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. 3 counts of wire fraud connected to the illegal seizures documented in the notebook. And 1 count of civil rights conspiracy. The charge that tied him explicitly to Morrow and Holt and to the 8-year structure of protection that had made Route 9 possible. For Dale Morrow conspiracy extortion, under color of official right-wire fraud and obstruction of justice, the obstruction charge covering his role in suppressing 4 prior excessive force investigations. For Bruce Holt, conspiracy wire fraud and federal witness intimidation, the last charge arising directly from the evidence lockup meeting and the specific words recorded there. Cross's court-appointed attorney assigned because the union had withdrawn support, and Cross's personal finances, once quietly supplemented by his share of the Route 9 operation, were insufficient for private counsel of the caliber this case required, looked at the indictment and the recording transcripts and the notebook entries and Barton's sworn statement and then requested a meeting with Cross that afternoon and told him with the directness of a professional who has learned that delaying an honest conversation only makes it more expensive that a plea was the rational path. Cross said he wanted a trial. He said a jury of ordinary Americans would understand what it was actually like to work a rural highway alone at night, what kinds of decisions a deputy had to make in fractions of a second, what the media was getting wrong about the context of the stop. He said 11 years of service had to count for something. His attorney made a note and said they would prepare for trial. The pre-trial weeks arrived and passed with the relentless efficiency of consequences operating in sequence. By the 3rd week, Cross's calls to his wife were going to voicemail. By the 6th week, an attorney from the next county had sent him a letter regarding divorce proceedings. By the 10th week, a for sale sign was in the yard of the house on Birchwood Lane because his wife had decided that the fastest path toward a life for herself and their 2 children did not involve waiting for Raymond Cross to navigate the federal criminal system. Each of these developments arrived in Cross's holding cell as information factual, sequential, each one narrowing the world he had believed was his by another measured degree. Morrow took a plea in the 4th week. His agreement negotiated in exchange for complete testimony against Cross and Holt brought his sentencing range to 8 to 12 years. He agreed to testify about all of it. The money, the incident reports, the phone calls, the specific understanding the 3 of them had shared about how the operation worked and what each of them received for their role in sustaining it. He had always been the administrative mind of the arrangement, and now that administrative mind turned to the task of cooperating with the same efficiency it had brought to 8 years of burying complaints. Holt held out for 30 days. At the end of 30 days, he also took a plea. Cross was informed through his attorney that both men who had constituted his protection were now witnesses for the government. He sat with this information in his cell for a full day and then told his attorney he still wanted a trial because even now, even stripped of his badge and his road and his freedom of movement and his marriage and his house and both of the men he had counted on, he still believed at some level below the reach of rational argument in his own version of events. It was the most durable thing about him, and it was going to be the thing that cost him the most. The night before trial, alone in his cell, Cross allowed himself to think about Deja Monroe for the first time since sentencing had been set. Not about the stop, not about the recording, not about the charges, but about the moment on Route 9 when she had walked past him toward the Tahoe and stopped and turned and looked at him. He tried to reconstruct what he had seen in her eyes, and found that he remembered it clearly, but couldn't name it. It wasn't hatred, wasn't triumph, wasn't any of the emotions he had expected or perhaps needed it to be. He lay in his bunk and looked at the ceiling, and understood in the particular way that comes to a person when all the other options have been removed, that whatever she had looked at him with was the truth, and that the truth was going to be in that courtroom in the morning, and that he had no answer for it. Deja Monroe arrived at the federal courthouse 40 minutes before proceedings began. She sat in the second row of the gallery with Major Garrett to her right, wearing her service uniform dress version pressed to a crease that could have cut paper rank insignia and campaign ribbons in their proper positions, not as a statement and not for display, but because she was a Marine and this was a significant occasion, and that was the beginning and the end of the reasoning. Cross was at the defense table when she came in. She saw him as she entered and then directed her attention forward because she had already seen everything she needed to see. A man in a gray suit that pulled slightly across the shoulders, sitting with his hands folded on the table surface and his eyes on the table surface, looking considerably smaller than the man who had walked toward her window on Route 9 with his jaw grinding and his thumb resting on his holster snap. Whatever had constituted his presence on that road had not survived the removal of its context. Whitfield's opening statement was spare and structured, and it ended not with a rhetorical flourish but with an action. He looked at the court officer managing the audio system and he said, "Play the recording, from the beginning." The recording played. 41 minutes and 22 seconds in a courtroom where the only sound was Route 9, the cicadas, the idling engine, the creak of the patrol car door, the gravel under footsteps, and then Raymond Cross's own voice arriving in the same sequence in which it had originally been spoken. License and registration. You people think putting on a uniform makes you special. Think it puts you in a different category from everybody else on my road. The jury heard the fabricated DUI justification. They heard Deja's narrated compliance reaching into the console, now moving to the door handle, stepping out, hands on the roof, delivered in a voice that was level and clear and without any of the aggression or resistance that Cross had described in his initial report. They heard the forearm impact. They heard the ankle kick. They heard Deja say, "I am cooperating fully and my commanding officer is on the phone," and they heard directly following those words the metallic click of a holster snap and Cross's voice dropping into the quieter, more dangerous register. "Get on your knees right now or I will put you down on this road." They heard Garrett's voice from the speaker. They heard Barton say, "Greg, she's not armed." They heard 41 minutes of a stop that Cross had written up in his incident report as a justified DUI detention of an aggressive, non-compliant subject. The recording played, and then it stopped. And in the silence that followed, every juror in the box was looking at something at the audio speaker at the table in front of them at their own hands. And none of them were looking at Cross because none of them were able to look at Cross right now. And Cross knew it, and he sat at his defense table, and he heard his own voice hanging in the air of the courtroom, and he felt something he had not felt since the night his thumb touched his holster. Snap on Route 9, the specific, nauseating vertigo of a man who has just discovered the floor isn't where he thought it was. His attorney objected 3 times during the recording's playback, overruled each time. The warrant was airtight. The recording was going to stay. Whitfield called Kyle Barton to the stand immediately following the recording while it was still in the room. Barton took the oath, sat down, and gave his account in the same sequential order in which it had actually happened, the directness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally been given a sanctioned place to set it down. Every detail matched the recording. When Cross's attorney cross-examined, suggesting that darkness distance and the influence of the recording on Barton's memory had shaped his recollection, Barton said, "I ran her plates before he reached her window and they came back clean, and I told him that. My memory of that moment doesn't come from any recording." Then Whitfield did something that had not been in the original trial schedule. He turned to the court officer and said, "Play segment 7 again, please. Just the 14 seconds beginning at minute 31. The court officer found the marker. The recording played. "You people think putting on a uniform makes you special. Think it puts you in a different category from everybody else on my road." Cross's voice again, in the same courtroom, at the same volume, in front of the same jury that had just heard 41 minutes of what followed from that sentence. Cross's left hand resting on the defense table contracted slightly, the fingers curling inward toward his palm, a small involuntary movement that his attorney did not notice and that 3 jurors did. His jaw tightened. He was hearing his own voice the way you hear something in a context that removes the protective story you built around it, stripped of the road and the darkness and the badge and the spotlight and every other thing that had made it feel in the moment like authority, rather than what it was. It was 14 seconds long, and it cost him more than the preceding 41 minutes had, because it was pointed, because it was chosen, because Whitfield had saved it for this moment, and Cross understood hearing it the second time exactly why. The court officer stopped the playback. Whitfield looked at the jury. He didn't say anything. He let the silence hold for a full 5 seconds, which is a very long time in a courtroom. And then he said, "The government rests its presentation for today, Your Honor." The judge called the afternoon recess. The gallery began to move slowly with the quality of people who need a moment before they can re-enter ordinary sound and motion. Cross sat at his defense table while his attorney gathered papers, and he did not move, and the 14 seconds played in his head again and again in the silence, and there was no longer anywhere to go with them, and no version of tonight in which they sounded like anything other than what they were. She was the government's final witness, and she walked to the stand with the bearing that was simply her resting state, not constructed for this occasion, not assembled for the gallery. Just the posture that her body had settled into so long ago, it no longer required any deliberate maintenance. She sat down and adjusted her position once and then was still, and she looked at Whitfield and waited. The examination began at the beginning. The logistics call with Garrett, the lights in the mirror at mile marker 11, the shoulder of Route 9, the dome light, the engine off, both hands on the wheel. Whitfield asked his questions in sequence, and Deja answered in sequence, and her answers had the texture of things that had been organized not in anticipation of testimony, but simply because they were true. And truth has a natural order when the person reporting it is committed to reporting it accurately and without embellishment. She did not reach for dramatic language. She did not perform either the horror of what had happened or the composure that had made survival possible. She described what had happened to her body on Route 9 the same way she'd describe a supply chain discrepancy. Here is what occurred, here is the sequence, here is what I observed and when I observed it. There was one moment when the testimony changed register. Whitfield asked, "Corporal Monroe, when Officer Cross pressed his service weapon against your back and ordered you to your knees, what were you thinking?" Deja was quiet for 3 full seconds. The courtroom, which had been quiet throughout, was quiet differently now. It was the quiet of a room that has just understood something is about to be said that will matter and is making space for it. She went inward in a way that was visible if you were watching her face closely, the way a person goes inward when they are going back to a real moment rather than constructing a response. "I was thinking about how to stay calm enough to survive the next 60 seconds, she said. The courtroom held it. Several jurors looked at her, not with pity, not with the particular discomfort of people encountering a story they want to remain at a distance from, but with the specific quality of attention that people bring to a thing that is completely true, and that they recognize as completely true. She had not said she was terrified. She had not said she was brave. She had said exactly what had been in her mind in 11 words, and those 11 words were more devastating than any amount of narrative surrounding them could have been. Whitfield let the moment hold for 2 seconds, and then moved to his next question because the professional instinct of a skilled prosecutor is to know when to stop adding to something that is already complete. Cross's attorney cross-examined. His approach was professional and competent, and built on the only available strategy given the evidence against his client, which was to suggest that Deja's choices during the stop had contributed to its escalation, that her decision not to immediately consent to a vehicle search had created the conditions for what followed, that a reasonable officer on a dark road might genuinely perceive certain behaviors as threatening, even when they were not intended as such. He was measured and thorough, and it made no difference, because every question he asked Deja answered by citing the specific legal basis for each right she had exercised. Fourth Amendment consent requirements, the right to inform an officer that proceedings are being witnessed, and distinguishing without heat or condescension between what the law permitted her to do and what Cross had chosen to do in response to her doing it. When he suggested that informing Cross that her commanding officer was listening might have been perceived by a reasonable officer as a challenge to his authority, Deja said, "I told him there was a witness because there was a witness, and because it seemed important that he know his actions were being observed." He responded by drawing his service weapon. I'm not able to characterize that response as anything other than what it was. The attorney looked at his notes. He looked at the jury. "Nothing further," he said, and sat down. Deja rose from the witness stand and stepped down, and as she crossed the front of the courtroom toward the gallery, she passed within 8 feet of the defense table. She did not look at Raymond Cross. Not because she was avoiding the look, not because she feared it or resented it, but because there was simply nothing left to communicate in that direction. She had said what she came to say on the record and under oath, and it was sufficient, and she was finished, and the direction her life was going was not the direction of the defense table. She returned to the second row. Garrett was sitting exactly as he had been. She sat beside him, and he looked at her briefly. The specific look of a commanding officer who is going to say nothing, because everything has been communicated already, by the quality of what she did on that stand, and by the fact that she did it the way she did everything, which was completely and without excess, and then he looked forward again. Whitfield stood. "The government rests your honor." The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 21 minutes. Cross's attorney, waiting in the corridor with a cup of vending machine coffee going cold in his hand, maintained the professional composure of someone who has learned to hold the distinction between what he hopes and what he knows, and what he knew from the moment Whitfield played the recording and then played the 14 seconds a second time was the difference between hope and knowledge clearly enough that the 4 hours and 21 minutes did not deceive him. The jury returned a verdict on all counts. Guilty. Cross received it the way someone receives a physical impact they were braced for but couldn't adequately prepare for anyway, a slight draining of color that moved upward from his collar. A single slow exhalation that was visible and then controlled the face doing the work of maintaining a surface while something beneath the surface gave way completely. His attorney placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, and Cross moved incrementally away from it, because the gesture required an acknowledgement of the moment that he was not ready to make. He was remanded into federal custody immediately. No bail, no further argument on the question. The house on Birchwood Lane, already listed, sold within 10 days of the verdict. The for sale sign came down on a Thursday in early October, and by the following weekend the new owners were moving in boxes, and Raymond Cross was in a federal holding cell replaying 41 minutes of his own voice in a room with a concrete ceiling and no one to call. On the morning of sentencing, the courtroom was full in a specific way, not the ordinary fullness of a public proceeding, but the gathered fullness of people who needed to be present for the completion of something. Deja and Garrett in the second row, same seats as every other day. Barton in civilian clothes near the back sitting straight. In the row just behind Deja, a woman named Constance Jeffries, Route 9, January 11:30 at night. $300 in grocery money, taken from her wallet under civil asset forfeiture, and never logged the complaint she filed, reviewed, and closed by Dale Morrow in 48 hours. Beside her, a man named Raymond Okafor, Route 9. March of the prior year. $420, same story. They had been located through Cross's notebook. They had been contacted by Cobb's office. They had come. Whitfield informed the court that Corporal Monroe would read a victim impact statement, and Deja walked to the podium and stood at it with her hands at her sides, and she did not open a folder because she had not brought one, because she had not written what she was going to say down anywhere, because she knew what she needed to say and didn't need to read it. She looked at the courtroom. She looked at Cross. 11 years ago, she said, Raymond Cross chose a stretch of road and decided it was his, not the department's, not the county's, his. And for 11 years, the people he stopped on that road learned the same lesson, that the badge could be turned against you, that the law could be used as a weapon, and that there was no complaint you could file, and no call you could make that would change what happened to you in the dark on Route 9. She paused not for effect, but because what came next needed its own space. I was the first person he stopped who already had a witness on the line before his lights hit my mirror. That's the only difference between my night on that road and every night documented in his notebook. The only difference is a phone call that was already open. She looked briefly at Constance Jeffries and Raymond Okafor in the gallery, then back at the room. What I want this court to understand is that today's sentence is not just for what was done to me. It is for everyone he chose specifically because he believed they had no recourse, and it is a promise to them finally that he was wrong. She returned to her seat. The courtroom was quiet in the way of a room where something important has landed and needs a moment before the next thing begins. The federal judge looked at Raymond Cross over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who has spent 2 decades on the bench and has long since developed the ability to tell with precision the difference between a person who made a mistake and a person who made a choice. His tone when he spoke was not theatrical. It was simply final. Mr. Cross, the judge said the evidence in this case establishes that you spent 11 years using public authority as a private instrument of control and financial extraction. You did not make an error in judgment on Route 9 on the night in question. You executed a routine you had performed many times before on a road you had selected for the purpose using methods you had refined over years. The sentence I am about to impose reflects the full duration of the harm documented in this proceeding, not the events of a single night. 16 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Because Cross was a former law enforcement officer, the Bureau of Prisons would house him in administrative segregation, protective custody for his own safety, which in practice meant 23 hours per day in a cell measuring 8 feet by 10 feet a bunk, a metal toilet, 1 narrow window looking at a wall, meals through a door slot, 1 hour of outdoor time in a concrete enclosure, no general population contact, not the dramatic suffering of a cinematic punishment, but the specific daily unchanging suffering of someone who has been removed from the world and its variation and placed in something that is the same every single day for 16 years. Morrow received 9 years. Holt received 6. Their sentences were delivered efficiently in a separate proceeding 2 days later because the federal docket treats related cases as distinct matters and processes them accordingly. And there is a particular administrative neatness to consequences when they operate at full institutional scale. The gavel came down. The federal marshals stood cross up, and as they turned him toward the doors at the side of the courtroom, his eyes moved across the gallery without intention. The involuntary sweep of a person leaving a room looking for something they don't have a name for, and found the second row. Deja Monroe was sitting perfectly straight, hands folded in her lap, watching him with the expression he had first seen on Route 9 after Garrett helped her to her feet. Not satisfaction, not pity, not the emotion of someone who has won something personal. It was the expression of a person who has seen something through to its completion, and knows it to be complete, and is ready to move on. It contained nothing that belonged to him, and never had. Cross looked away first. He would spend a considerable portion of the next 16 years trying to understand why that mattered to him as much as it did. The Department of Justice placed the Denton County Sheriff's Department under a federal consent decree 41 days after sentencing, and the formal document was 3 pages long and used careful institutional language to describe something that was not careful or institutional at all. The finding that a law enforcement department had been functioning for the better part of a decade as a layered arrangement in which certain officers extracted money and submission from civilians on isolated roads. Certain supervisors transformed evidence of this into favorable paperwork, and a union official transformed the favorable paperwork into institutional permanence. The consent decree named all 3 functions and required the restructuring of every mechanism that had made each of them possible. The audit ran for 14 weeks. 8 independent federal monitors reviewing 8 years of use of force reports, arrest records, complaint files, and the overtime and civil asset forfeiture logs that Barton's testimony and Cross's notebook had identified as the areas of greatest concern. What they found was not a collection of isolated incidents by individual officers making independent bad decisions. It was a pattern stops that concentrated on specific corridors and specific demographics in ways that exceeded any plausible explanation based on crime distribution, data complaint, investigations that resolved in favor of the officer at rates that were statistically impossible to achieve through honest review evidence logs with gaps that aligned precisely with the date entries in Cross's notebook. 11 officers were identified through the audit as having patterns that could not be explained by ordinary variation. 6 were terminated with cause. 3 were indicted on charges related to illegal seizure and civil forfeiture fraud. 2 of them had been running smaller versions of what Cross had done on different roads with less organization, but the same essential logic that the dark stretches between places are unmonitored, and that unmonitored space is opportunity. 2 more resigned before the audit concluded, for reasons everyone understood, were not the personal reasons stated in the paperwork. The 11 individuals named in Cross's notebook as victims of illegal seizures were located through records that Barton's testimony had helped to decode. Their names went into a court order. The county facing the civil lawsuit that 4 of them had filed within 30 days of Cross's arrest negotiated a settlement that included direct financial restitution to all 11 specific dollar amounts, tied to specific notebook entries plus interest calculated from the date of each seizure. The checks were cut within 90 days. The money went back to the people it had been taken from, some of whom had spent years believing it was simply gone the way things taken by official authority tend to simply be gone. Route 9 got streetlights. Not a symbolic gesture, a capital improvement project funded through the consent decree's infrastructure requirements addressing the physical conditions that had made the corridor function the way it had functioned for 11 years. The lights went up in late November, and the first night they were operational, the deputy running the evening patrol on that stretch noted in his log that you could see from marker 7 to marker 19 without a flashlight, without the cruiser's spotlight in the ordinary ambient light of the new installation. He noted it because it was different, because it had not been true before, and because difference on a road that had been unchanged for so long felt like something worth recording. Kyle Barton was promoted to lieutenant 4 months after sentencing. Chief Pruitt placed him in charge of the newly restructured Internal Affairs Division. The mandate delivered in the same direct economical register that Pruitt used for everything that mattered. You know what this office was used for. You worked alongside the man it was used to protect for 6 months, and you know exactly how it operated. Make sure it never operates that way again. The first structural change Barton made was a direct anonymous reporting line to the FBI field office. a mechanism by which any officer in the department could report misconduct without going through the internal chain of command, without their name being attached to the report in any document accessible within the department, without any requirement to involve a supervisor at any stage. It was the exact structural opposite of what Morrow and Holt had built instead of a system designed to absorb complaints and neutralize them before they reached anyone with the authority and independence to act. It was a system that routed complaints directly to that authority and bypassed everything in between. The first anonymous report came in on the third day after the line was established. It concerned an officer on the eastern rural route who had been conducting stops with a pattern that looked to whoever filed the report like something they'd seen before. Cobb's office received it within an hour. By the end of the week, the officer in question had been placed on administrative leave pending review. The change in the department's broader culture did not happen all at once, because cultures built over a decade do not undo themselves in a month, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never tried to change one. It happened the way temperature changes in a large room, gradually through accumulated small adjustments, some of them visible and some not. A veteran officer had a conversation with a rookie in the parking lot one evening in December, and what the veteran said was something true that the veteran had known for a long time and had never said aloud before, and the rookie listened and filed it away. An officer who had been passed over 3 times for a promotion he had clearly earned passed over because he had never been willing to perform the particular kind of loyalty that Cross's arrangement required was reconsidered and promoted in March. A training session on lawful stops and consent requirements was added to the annual certification requirement, and the officer who ran it was Barton himself, who had something to say on the subject that came from a place most instructors couldn't reach. None of this made the news. But it was happening, and it was real, and it was the thing that mattered most, not the sentences which were important, and not the restitution which was necessary, but the slow, difficult, imperfect process of a department becoming something closer to what it had always claimed to be. The parade deck at Fort Caldwell was in clean November morning light when the battalion assembled, the kind of light that arrives in coastal North Carolina in autumn with a clarity that the summer's humidity makes impossible sharp-edged and honest, the air still carrying a chill at this hour that would soften by mid-morning, but right now felt precise and appropriate for a ceremony that was also going to be precise and appropriate. The smell of cut grass was in the air, the sound of boots on concrete. Somewhere across the installation, the low drone of a transport helicopter making its approach to the landing pad, utterly ordinary, the installation going about its business around the edges of this particular moment. Deja Monroe stood at the position of attention in front of the assembled formation, and she was wearing her dress uniform, and it was pressed to the standard it had always been pressed to on every occasion she had ever worn it, because that was the standard, and the standard did not vary based on the significance of the moment. It applied equally to the significant moments and the unremarkable ones, which was part of what made it a standard worth keeping. Major Elijah Garrett stood at the podium, and he read from the promotion citation in the carrying measured voice he used for all formal occasions and what the citation described. What Garrett read aloud to the assembled battalion in the November morning light was the events of Route 9 rendered not as victimhood, not as a legal proceeding, not as a story about what had been done to her, but as a demonstration of the 3 core values of the United States Marine Corps, in a setting that most people would not have recognized as a test of those values, because most people think of honor, courage, and commitment in the context of combat, rather than in the context of a woman keeping her hands flat on the roof of her own car while someone who had power over her in that moment tried everything in his power to break her composure and failed completely. Garrett read what she had done. He read it specifically in sequence without flourish, the dome light turned on before he reached her window, the engine off, both hands visible, every movement narrated, the compliance maintained through the forearm in her back, and the boot on her ankle, and the gun at her spine. The phone call kept open, the record built in real time. He read what that record had become: federal charges, federal convictions, a consent decree, 11 families with restitution checks, a 12-mile stretch of road with lights on it for the first time in 8 years. He described what she had refused to let that night take from her, and what that refusal had cost 3 other people who had believed they were beyond the reach of what one woman on her knees on gravel could accomplish. He stepped down from the podium and walked to her. He picked up the sergeant's chevrons from the small table beside her and pinned them one and then the other onto the collar of her dress uniform. And when he stepped back, he looked at her for a moment, confirming something he already knew. Something that had been apparent to him since the night he heard the first words of the stop on the Bluetooth connection, and felt the specific quality of attention shift in his chest. And then he brought his right hand up in a salute. Deja returned it sharp and clean, and the sound that came from the assembled formation was the particular sound of people who do a difficult thing and know in their bodies what it costs someone to do it with the discipline and precision that she had brought to it. It was not polite applause. It was recognition, which is different and means more. Later, after the formation had been dismissed and the deck was clearing, and the families of the promoted Marines were gathering at the edges in the small clusters of celebration that follow military ceremonies, Garrett found her standing where the concrete met the grass at the southern edge of the parade deck. He stood beside her, not quite side by side, the way 2 people who have been through something together stand when they don't need proximity to communicate what they've been through. "You submitted the OCS application," he said. It was not a question. 3 weeks ago," she said. He nodded. Once. That was it, the entirety of his response, and it contained everything he would have said if he were a different kind of person who said more than the situation required. She stood there for a while after he walked back toward the administration building alone on the edge of the parade deck with the morning light coming in from the east and the ordinary operational sound of the installation moving around her in every direction. She looked south toward the tree line, and beyond it, 5 miles away, invisible from here, Route 9. She thought about it briefly without any of the visceral texture that the thought had carried in the first weeks after the chest-tightening half-second, when she would hear a car accelerate on a dark road behind her, the way her hands would find the 10 and 2 position instinctively when a patrol car appeared in her rear view. Those responses had faded over the months the way acute things fade when the situation that created them has been resolved. What remained was something flatter and clearer knowledge rather than sensation. The knowledge of what had happened on that road and what had come of it and what the road was now. Lit, patrolled differently, populated by the weight of consequences that had not previously existed. She had driven it twice since the lights went up. It was a road lit by ordinary sodium vapor lights going where it had always gone. She straightened her new chevrons with 2 precise automatic adjustments, the habit of someone who has worn a uniform long enough that maintenance of it is inseparable from maintenance of self. And she turned away from the tree line and walked back inside the installation toward the paperwork and the preparation and everything that was going to come next, all of which was entirely and completely her own. 8 months after sentencing on an evening in early spring, when the air on Route 9 was cool and clean and smelled like the pine trees beginning their long thaw back toward green. Deputy Lena Marsh ran a routine traffic stop at mile marker 11. She had been on the job for 14 months through the consent decree's initial implementation, through the mandatory retraining, through the department-wide audit that had changed the names and faces in the supervisor roles and the internal affairs office and the union leadership. She was not an experienced officer yet, but she was not a naive one, and she had read the Route 9 case file as part of the department's revised new officer orientation required reading. Now, not as a cautionary tale about individual misconduct, but as a case study in what meticulous documentation the preservation of evidence and the refusal to be broken could accomplish when the institutional structure around a person seemed entirely designed to make those things impossible. She had read it twice because the second time she noticed things the first reading hadn't prepared her for. The car she stopped was a late-model Honda dark blue, and the taillight on the driver's side had flickered twice in rapid succession somewhere around marker 9. Not a failure, just a brief irregularity that technically constituted a citable equipment issue and practically constituted a legitimate reason to make contact and let the driver know before it became a problem. She hit her lights. She brought her cruiser to the wide, well-lit shoulder the new sodium vapor lights were on from marker 7, all the way to marker 19, steady and orange and entirely ordinary, and she clocked the registration as she was walking up, already coming back clean. She brought her flashlight but didn't lead with it. She walked to the driver's window at a measured pace, and before she said anything else, she said, "Good evening, ma'am. I'm Deputy Marsh, Denton County." And then she explained the reason for the stop, the taillight, the flicker probably a loose contact in the housing easy fix worth knowing about before it got worse. The woman in the Honda was in her early 40s, wearing hospital scrubs, a Fort Caldwell employee badge clipped to the lanyard around her neck. Her hands were at 10 and 2 on the wheel. Her interior dome light was on. Her window was already down. Her body carried the particular controlled quality of someone who has already run through a set of protocols before the deputy reached her window. Not because she'd been trained the way a Marine is trained, but because she was a black woman driving Route 9 at night, and she had been running through those protocols every time she made this drive. For as long as she had been driving it, which was 3 years, because the road existed before Raymond Cross was arrested, and the road existed after, and the knowledge of what this road had been was not something you set down easily or quickly or all at once. There was a quality in her eyes when Marsh reached the window. Something that was not fear exactly, but the residue of fear. The memory of it held in a body that had learned to carry the memory as a standing condition. She looked at Deputy Marsh, and there was a fraction of a second visible if you were paying the right kind of attention, in which she was assessing something that Marsh had not yet done anything to require her to assess. Marsh saw it. She had been trained to see it not in the context of threat assessment, but in the context of the consent decree's community relations framework, which said plainly and specifically that on Route 9 in particular, the people you stop may carry reasons for their caution that have nothing to do with guilt, and that recognizing this without making it a performance is part of the job. It had been said plainly in the training. Marsh had read it, and then she had read the Route 9 case file, and now she was standing at this window, and she understood in a way that no training document could fully produce what the plainness of that instruction was trying to reach. "Your registration is current, your record is clean," Marsh said. "The light looks like a loose connection in the housing. It's a common issue with this model. Any mechanic can fix it in 10 minutes. She handed the license back. "Drive safe tonight." The woman looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than a simple license transaction required. "Thank you," she said, and the two words carried something in them that was not just gratitude for a low-stakes traffic stop. "Of course," Marsh said, and stepped back and meant it. The Honda pulled back onto Route 9. The woman watched Deputy Marsh's lights in her mirror receding steady ordinary, and she exhaled a slow and releasing breath that had been accumulated over the duration of the stop, and perhaps over longer than that. Over all the drives on this road in the years before the lights went up, and the department changed. And someone made it her business to know what this road had been, and to drive it differently. The sodium vapor light stretched ahead of her all the way to the county line, and the road ahead was lit and clear, and the trees on either side of it were just trees. Raymond Cross was in the administrative segregation unit of a federal penitentiary in Virginia, and had been for 8 months, and the 8 months had taught him things about time that he had not known before, or rather things that he had known abstractly but not with the full weight of living them, which is a different kind of knowing entirely. Time in an 8x10 cell with one narrow window does not move the way time moves when there are things to occupy it. It is slow and exact and announces itself at every hour, and there is no moment absorbing enough that you look up and find it has passed without your awareness. Every hour requires you to be present for it. That is the design. He thought about Route 9 with a frequency he had not anticipated when he was standing on it 11 years into a career that he had believed was as permanent as the road itself. He had returned to it so many times in 8 months that he could reconstruct it in specific detail the way the shoulder widened near marker 9, the sound gravel made under his boots, the particular angle of his cruiser's spotlight when he angled it at a mirror to blind the driver before he even opened his door. The habits and the methods and the 11 years of small refinements that had made Route 9 what it was. He could walk through all of it in his head, and he did on the bad days and on the days that were too quiet, which were most of them. He tried to remember Deja Monroe's face. He had been trying since his first week in the cell, and he could not assemble it reliably. Her eyes sometimes, or the set of her jaw in the cruiser's spotlight, or the quality of stillness she maintained on the gravel, but not her face complete, not all of it at once. What he could remember, with a clarity that had not faded in 8 months that showed no sign of fading, was her hands. Both of them flat against the roof of her Honda fingers spread wide, the pressure of them even and deliberate. Through the forearm in her back and the boot on her ankle and the gun at her spine, her hands had not moved and they had not trembled and they had not tried to protect themselves. They had simply remained exactly where she had placed them, which was where she needed them to be. He had spent 11 years on Route 9, needing his subjects to give him something fear submission, the particular yielding quality of someone who understands that they have no recourse. He had gotten it from most of them most of the time, because most people alone on a dark road at 11 o'clock at night, with a man in a uniform applying force to their body, will do almost anything to make it stop. He had built his entire professional self on that understanding of how people behaved under pressure. Her hands had never given him anything. Through the entire stop, through everything he had done, her hands had remained flat on the roof of the car with the fingers spread wide, and they had been doing something, building something, holding something open, keeping a record. And he had been too certain of his own power to understand in that moment that the thing her hands were doing was more durable than anything he had ever done on Route 9 in 11 years. He understood it now. He lay in his bunk and looked at the narrow window and the wall beyond it, and he understood it now with the complete and useless clarity of understanding that arrives when all the other options have been taken away, and there is nothing left to do with the understanding except hold it. Her hands on the roof of her car. His hands the same hands that had placed a gun at her spine. The same hands that had kicked her ankle. The same hands that had built 8 years of a notebook now idle in a concrete room for 16 years, doing nothing, building nothing, holding nothing. Sergeant Deja Monroe was not on Route 9 tonight. She was in her quarters at Fort Caldwell at her small desk under a lamp that cast a warm circle of light across the surface, with her officer candidate school materials spread out in front of her. The forms, the personal statement she had been refining for 3 weeks, the 2 letters of recommendation she had received back already, both of which said more about her than she would have said about herself, which was appropriate because that was the nature of letters of recommendation from people who had actually watched you do something. She had a cup of coffee that had gone mostly cold sitting at the corner of the desk where she kept putting it down and forgetting it while she was working through a paragraph. She was not thinking about Cross. She had not thought about him in weeks, not in the active way of someone returning to something unresolved because it was resolved and the resolution was documented in a federal court record and a consent decree and 11 restitution checks and a stretch of highway with lights on it and a notebook in an evidence room that would be there long after everyone in this story had moved on to whatever came next. She was thinking about what came next. The application, the board review. The pipeline, if accepted, which it would be not from arrogance, but from honest self-assessment, which she was good at, because she had been trained to be honest, and had taken that training seriously. The assignments beyond that. The Marines she would eventually lead. The things she hadn't done yet in places she hadn't been yet that were hers to do. She picked up her pen. She looked at the paragraph she'd been working on, read it back to herself quietly in the lamp-lit room, crossed out one sentence, wrote a better one, read it again. It was right. She kept writing. Outside the window of her quarters, Fort Caldwell was doing what it always did. Always in motion, always at work. The machinery of a large installation that does not stop for the night, but only shifts into a different register, quieter and more deliberate. And 5 miles away, invisible in the trees, Route 9 was lit from Marker 7 to Marker 19, and a woman in hospital scrubs was driving home after a long shift. Watching the lights go by one after another, steady and orange and entirely unremarkable the way lights on a road are supposed to be, and the road was just a road and the dark spaces between the lights were just dark spaces and the trees were just trees. It had always been just a road. Now it finally looked like one. If this story of justice, military honor, and the power of doing the right thing under pressure moved you, please hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it helps us bring more stories like this one to you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that nobody is above the law, no matter how protected they think they are. Every share matters. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new story. We release one every single week. Drop a comment below and tell us what was the moment that hit you hardest. We read every single one of them. Thank you for being here, and we will see you in the next one.